The Modern Empiricism, Part 2. So we should see the tumult of thought as a wave that we're part of, and we can become more aware of how we're unfolding that thought by seeing its history. So, for instance, it's not so that the modern development is unitary and moving only towards, for instance, positivism. So we can make some orientation by thinking of, for instance, the Scottish Enlightenment thinker Adam Ferguson says it's absolutely impossible to found a science that's serious by comparing the human being to other animals, to animals. He doesn't even say to other animals, to organism, to uh, um, the lower animals. The human being has to be taken simply on its own ground. Um, Diderot is saying that the human being cannot be displaced from the center of existence because the human being is the origin of meaning, and meaning is what makes existence worthwhile. It doesn't make any sense to have a science that isn't centered on the human being. Let's make a connection between judgment. This is just called judgment and meaning. So I was saying that there's this problem Tarkovsky was having with envisaging how the daily life was. From within that daily life, which was thought to basically remain the same until the early modern development, until you get all the historical consciousness so-called. So we could call that the Aristotelian attitude. Daily life is always the same, but you get different arrangements, so that what you always look for is a polis of a certain kind, and that's an essential form, and it's different from just a village or a few people running around. It's this ground out of the imagining of what's the daily life like, in which you get the communities of confreres or colleagues or different specialists who then amongst themselves decide which observations are to be accepted as sensible and which aren't, which after they meet that threshold of acceptable observation then become, as it were, more like what we think a fact is. It's something with a number attached to it, something that you can say we've compared this to this, and this is the exact difference, and you get data as fact. This movement between going as far as we can towards what can be lodged in a kind of world picture of facts, and on the other hand, what is looking more at the ground out of the daily communities, points us more towards the so-called criticalism. The critical theory, for example, is we could get some orientation by saying, so even though in Peterson world, there's you can see, since you can see the development from the Frankfurt School, let's say Adorno and Walter Benjamin and so on, who were against Nazis before Nazism even existed, and spent the 30s attacking them, the Institute for Social Research. This movement then became the Judith Butler and to get these other people in UC Berkeley and so on, not just in the sociology department, they housed them also in the rhetoric department and the German department and so on. But the connection here is that one is on the side of the difficulties raised by the modern empiricist spirit, and the other is on the side of the gains made through treating the data as something which had been captured, so to speak. It could now be part of the prosthetic operations of manipulating the data for the sake of technological efficiency. I give an example of the movement of the ground. You have the Platonic psychology, and then one can ask if one can compare it to another, which is not an experimental psychology, but it's a psychology which takes for granted experience with human beings. So we have some observations. Some people are like this. They favor sensual pleasure over almost everything else. Some people are more striving and competitive. They're the more political people. And you just look, and some people are more, they can't, they're anxious unless they can clarify their thoughts to themselves, the logos type. And then you can just look and see if there's people like that. But we can't look from out of Plato's Athens. We could only look from our own time. And maybe the ground has changed so much that's no longer the best way to look at it. Then if we have some other form of this sort of psychology on a similar basis, so the Jungian types, for instance, we could make a comparison and then see, has Jung made an improvement over the Platonic psychology? But now a third question opens up. Was Plato already in history such that Athens was just one cave alongside others? And what right does Plato have to say this is an improvement in intelligibility over the way the community is already thinking? Has Plato actually done what he claims and go above the ordinary opinions prevalent in Athens at his time with his account of personality? Or has he created a sort of positivism, a primitive positivism, which is naive of the problem of the change in the common sense and the change of the one making the observation? So Heidegger is saying here that it can be misunderstood. So in the translation, Heidegger often says something like, the Greeks can speak with us and we can speak with them. But what he doesn't mean that we can sort of have some kind of communion with the Greeks or something like that. We're how do they put that we're sort of raising their spirits up or coming into contact with them. What he means is there's a text, and the text is empty unless you have some understanding of what the text says. It's just a piece of wood or a scroll or something. There's symbols on it, but we need the interpretations of the symbols. When he says it would be good to know what the German was for these phrases, oft repeated in Heidegger, but I'm not sure. But the meaning is with them means it's as though we're using these symbols to become this mode of judgment, this mode of the direct community of Athens at that time, how they saw these problems and how they attempted to rise out of them. They can use us also means that in a certain way we are them, and that there's no other being that is this meaning or judgment which could take up that book, read it, and be that community and see through and become them. You see, and see which observations are to be accepted and not accepted out of their Dasein. So that brings us into why existentialism stands in a kind of opening which wasn't available to Plato, because Plato didn't really think seriously about going about these difficulties that have only been raised once the modern difficulties that we just went into have been raised. You see, trying to lay it out like that, like I've just been doing, shows that the difficulties are much more of a hodgepodge and much less of something where you can suddenly say here, here, and here. We can make a strict schema and say this is where this problem of the transcendental ego came in because of certain reasons, and then this raised this problem or this raised that problem. But somehow the problems are seen to be already there in Platon in this beginning time, and they're all sort of they can be unfolded in different ways, different directions, which makes it the thinker then has to be able to hold several unfoldings together at the same time. This is in a certain way. This is part of a strategy to thinking, which is also maybe an ability which can be developed in the course of thinking. We have to hold different senses of what's happening before ourselves at the same time in order to unfold the thinking. Going forward, I'd want to do some more on, in this connection, how Hayek and Peterson are overlapping in their accounts. Whether Peterson has taken over Hayek's account, I don't know. Like read it, understood it in some way, and modified it according to his own path, or whether he simply came across it in his own way. But quite a few questions regarding to sort of how to steer the ship of state come out of these problems of what the relationship is between the strict positivist data, then called facts, and this open zone, which supposedly points in the early moderns to the human or to judgment. But if you go back behind Plato, I think I can show that there's a kind of an abyss opens up, because you can't do as Hayek is doing and just say people are unhappy today because we're not like the primitive early bands of society. Instead, we have rules that we have to follow, which are impersonal. It doesn't seem to make sense, because there wasn't the question of happiness or unhappiness. The Hobbes and Rousseau type questions didn't quite exist in the early bands. The question was only raised at a certain point after you had impersonal society with impersonal rules, after people like Draco had come into existence and so on. But I want to try to show that more with more perspicacity, or with just a greater clarity.